Ramadi, that scar, is it you? What shocking secret will unfold? What are you talking about? I'm just an ordinary person. A waitress has laughed at for her scars until a veteran recognizes the unit tattoo. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt parking lot of Mel's roadside diner, a weathered establishment that had served travelers along Highway 87 in West Texas for over 30 years. Inside, the familiar sounds of sizzling bacon, clinking coffee cups, and muted conversation created the comfortable rhythm of another ordinary day. Sarah Miller moved between the worn vinyl booths with practiced efficiency, her 35-year-old frame carrying the weight of experiences that most people could never imagine. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the standard uniform of black slacks and a white button-down shirt with sleeves that she unconsciously tugged down throughout her shift. The burn scars that traced across her left shoulder, neck, and arm were impossible to hide completely despite her careful attention to clothing choices. They were the kind of scars that drew stares and whispered conversations, the kind that made people create stories in their minds about accidents, house fires, or other tragedies they couldn't quite comprehend. What incredible truth lies beneath? What the customers at Mel's diner didn't know was that Sarah's scars told a story of heroism, not tragedy. They were the permanent reminders of an IED explosion near Ramadi. In 2006, when Army medic Sarah Miller had thrown herself over a wounded soldier to shield him from the blast that would end her military career, but save his life. For 3 years now, Sarah had worked the morning shift at the diner, serving coffee and comfort food to truckers, travelers, and locals who had grown accustomed to her quiet competence. She never got an order wrong, always brought extra napkins to tables with children, and maintained a professional demeanor that earned respect, even from those who whispered about her appearance. The regulars had learned not to ask questions. Some speculated about her past, a car accident maybe, or a kitchen fire. Others simply accepted her presence as part of the diner's landscape, appreciating her efficiency and the way she anticipated their needs without unnecessary conversation. Sarah preferred it that way. Anonymity was a luxury she had chosen deliberately after her medical discharge from the Army. The medals in her dresser drawer at home, including a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star with V device, remained hidden, just like the faded 3rd to 5th Infantry tattoo on her forearm that she kept carefully covered. In this small corner of Texas, she was just Sarah the waitress, not Sergeant Sarah Miller, combat medic, who had saved 17 lives during 2 tours in Iraq before her own service came to an abrupt and painful end. The morning rush had settled into its familiar rhythm when the group of out-of-town contractors arrived, their loud voices and crude humor immediately disrupting the diner's peaceful atmosphere. They were working on a pipeline project outside town and had made Mel's their regular breakfast stop, much to Sarah's dismay. "Hey, Scarface," called out Chad, the apparent leader of the group, as Sarah approached their table with coffee. "Try not to spill any on us. We don't want to end up looking like you." His companions laughed at the cruel joke, their eyes following Sarah's movements as she poured coffee with steady hands, her face showing no reaction to their taunts. She had learned long ago that responding only encouraged them, and that dignity was sometimes the only armor available against such cruelty. "What happened to you anyway?" asked another contractor, his voice loud enough to carry across the diner. "House fire, car wreck, or did someone do that to you on purpose?" Sarah continued her work silently, refilling their cups and taking their orders with professional efficiency. Her military training had taught her to function under pressure, to maintain composure even when under attack. These men were not enemy combatants, they were just cruel civilians who had never learned respect. At a corner booth, an elderly couple exchanged uncomfortable glances but said nothing. At the counter, a trucker focused intently on his newspaper, avoiding eye contact. The other customers had grown accustomed to these morning performances, most choosing to ignore the harassment rather than intervene. "I bet she can't even smile with all that scar tissue," Chad continued, emboldened by the lack of response from both Sarah and the other patrons. "Must be why she works in a dump like this. Who else would hire someone who looks like that?" Sarah's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on her coffee pot, but her expression remained neutral. She thought about the soldiers she had treated in field hospitals, young men and women who had suffered far worse injuries than hers, who had faced their pain with courage and determination. Their memory gave her strength to endure these petty cruelties. Can this moment change everything? It was then that the diner's front door opened with the soft chime of its bell, and a man in his early 40s entered. He wore faded jeans, work boots, and a weathered Marine Corps cap that had seen better days. His bearing was unmistakably military, straight posture, alert eyes that automatically scanned the room, and the careful measured movements of someone who had learned to assess threats and opportunities in an instant. Michael Kelly had been driving cross-country, taking his time to visit places he had never seen during his years of military service. The diner looked like the kind of place that served honest food and strong coffee, exactly what he needed after spending the night in a roadside motel. As he settled into a booth near the window, His eyes found Sarah moving between the tables. Something about her bearing caught his attention, the way she carried herself with quiet dignity despite the obvious harassment she was receiving from the contractors. He had seen that kind of composure before in combat zones where maintaining professionalism could mean the difference between life and death. When Sarah approached his table, her sleeve rolled up slightly as she reached for his coffee cup, revealing just a glimpse of scarred skin and something else, the faded edge of what looked like a military tattoo. Coffee? Sarah asked quietly, her voice carrying the neutral tone she used with all customers. Please, Michael replied, studying her face with the intensity of someone trying to place a half-remembered memory. And thank you. As Sarah poured Michael's coffee, he noticed the way she moved, efficient, purposeful, with the kind of spatial awareness that came from working in high-pressure environments where every second mattered. When she turned to leave, her sleeve shifted again, and this time he caught a clearer glimpse of the tattoo on her forearm. The partial letters he could see made his breath catch in his throat. 3rd to 5th was barely visible, but for someone who had served in Iraq, those numbers carried profound significance. The 3rd Infantry Division, 5th Brigade Combat Team, had been one of the most decorated units in the Iraq War. Known for their courage under fire and their exceptional medical corps, Michael's mind raced back to a dusty street in Romani, 2006, where an IED had nearly ended his life. He remembered the chaos, the pain, and most clearly the hands of a medic who had worked frantically to keep him alive while under enemy fire. He had never seen her face clearly through the blood and smoke, but he remembered her voice, calm and professional, telling him he was going to be okay. Meanwhile, the contractors were escalating their harassment. Hey, Frankenstein, Chad called out as Sarah passed their table again. My eggs are cold, maybe if you moved faster instead of limping around like a broken toy, the food would still be hot when it gets to the table. Sarah stopped at their table, her posture straight, despite the verbal assault. I'll have the cook prepare fresh eggs for you, she said quietly, reaching for the plate. Don't touch it with those mangled hands, another contractor said with disgust. Who knows what diseases you might be carrying? The cruelty of the comments sent a ripple of discomfort through the diner. Even the regulars, who usually ignored the harassment, looked up from their meals, their faces showing embarrassment at their own inaction. A small child at a nearby table, unaware of the adult dynamics playing out around him, looked up at Sarah with innocent curiosity. Lady, did it hurt? He asked, pointing at her scars. Sarah's expression softened as she looked down at the boy. Not as much as being forgotten, she replied quietly, a response that carried more weight than anyone in the diner could understand. Michael felt something click into place in his memory, that voice, that calm professionalism in the face of crisis. He had heard it before in the worst moment of his life. He stood up from his booth and walked toward Sarah, his heart pounding with the possibility of a connection he had thought lost forever. Excuse me, Michael said as Sarah finished cleaning the contractor's table, could I ask you something? Sarah looked up at him, noting the respect in his voice and the military bearing that marked him as a fellow veteran. Of course. Michael's eyes went to her forearm, where the sleeve had shifted again to reveal more of the tattoo. That tattoo, he said softly. 3rd to 5th Infantry, you served in Iraq. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah had spent 3 years avoiding this exact moment, the recognition that would strip away her carefully constructed anonymity. But something in Michael's eyes, respect not pity, made her nod slowly. 2 tours, she said simply. Medic. Michael's face went pale as the pieces of his memory fell into place. Romani 2006 IED on Route, Michigan. You were the medic? What? Sarah asked, though she was beginning to understand where this conversation was leading. Who saved my life? Michael finished, his voice thick with emotion. Corporal Michael Kelly, 2nd Battalion. You pulled me out of that Humvee and kept me alive for 40 minutes until the medevac arrived. The diner had grown quiet, the usual morning chatter fading as customers sensed something significant happening. Even the contractors had stopped their conversation, watching the interaction between Sarah and the Marine veteran. Sarah studied Michael's face and slowly recognition dawned in her eyes. You were the one with the shrapnel in your chest, she said quietly. You kept asking about your squad. They all made it home because of you, Michael said, his voice carrying across the silent diner. Every single one of them. The revelation transformed the atmosphere in the restaurant. The contractors looked uncomfortable, beginning to understand that their target was not a victim, but a hero. The regular customers felt ashamed of their months of silent complicity in Sarah's harassment. Michael reached up and removed his Marine Corps cap, holding it over his heart in a gesture of profound respect. Sergeant Miller, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, thank you for my life. The silence that followed Michael's recognition was so complete that the sound of the coffee pot's automatic brewing cycle seemed amplified throughout the diner. Sarah stood frozen, her carefully constructed wall of anonymity crumbling around her as every eye in the restaurant focused on the unfolding drama. Chad and his fellow contractors looked as though they had been physically struck. The realization that they had been tormenting a decorated combat veteran who had saved lives in Iraq created a crisis of conscience that was written plainly across their faces. The cruel jokes about her scars, the mocking comments about her appearance, the deliberate humiliation, all of it now stood revealed as attacks on an American hero. You're really a war hero," stammered one of the contractors, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's response was characteristic of her quiet dignity. "I'm not a hero," she said simply, "I was just doing my job." But Michael wasn't going to let her deflect the recognition she deserved. "Your job," he said, his voice growing stronger, "was to save lives under enemy fire. Your job was to run toward danger when everyone else was running away, and you did it with courage that most people can't even imagine." The elderly couple, who had been regular customers for months, stood up from their booth, the husband removing his own cap in a gesture of respect. "Thank you for your service, Sergeant," the woman said, her voice shaking with emotion. "We're sorry we never knew." The crisis deepened as other customers began to understand the magnitude of what had been happening in their presence. For months, they had watched Sarah endure harassment and had done nothing to intervene. They had allowed a combat veteran to be humiliated while they sat silently complicit in their inaction. "We should have said something," murmured the trucker at the counter, his newspaper forgotten as he struggled with his own guilt. "We should have stood up for her." Bob Johnson, the diner's manager, emerged from the kitchen where he had been listening to the conversation. His face was red with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. Embarrassment at his own failure to protect his employee and anger at the customers who had made her life miserable. "Ma'am," Bob said to Sarah, his voice formal with newfound respect, "I want you to take the rest of your shift off with pay, and I want you to know that anyone who disrespects you in my establishment will be asked to leave immediately." The contractors were now facing a crisis of their own. Their behavior, which had seemed like harmless fun just minutes before, was now exposed as cruel harassment of a disabled veteran. The shame was overwhelming, and they began to understand that their actions had consequences beyond their immediate entertainment. "We didn't know," Chad said desperately, his earlier bravado completely gone. "If we had known you were a veteran, would it have mattered?" Sarah asked quietly, her question cutting through their excuses like a blade. "Should it take a uniform to earn basic human decency?" The challenge in her words forced everyone in the diner to confront their own prejudices and assumptions. How many other veterans were living among them unrecognized and unappreciated? How many other people were being judged by their appearance rather than their character? Michael stepped closer to Sarah, his presence offering support in this moment of unwanted exposure. "You don't owe anyone an explanation," he told her. "You've already given more than enough." But Sarah was facing her own internal crisis. For 3 years, she had hidden her service, avoiding the questions and the pity that came with recognition. She had chosen anonymity as a form of protection, but now that protection was gone, the scars that had been sources of shame were being revealed as badges of honor, and she wasn't sure how to handle the transformation. "I just wanted to be left alone," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "I just wanted to do my job and not have to explain myself to anyone." "And you shouldn't have to," Michael replied firmly, "but now that the truth is out, maybe things can be different. Maybe you can finally get the respect you've always deserved." The crisis had exposed not just Sarah's hidden identity, but the failure of an entire community to recognize and protect one of their own. The question now was whether this moment of recognition could transform years of indifference into something better. Will this revelation change lives? The transformation in the diner's atmosphere was immediate and profound. Word of Sarah's identity spread quickly through the small restaurant as customers whispered among themselves, sharing the revelation that their quiet waitress was a decorated combat veteran who had saved lives in Iraq. Michael remained standing beside Sarah, his presence serving as both protection and validation. He could see the internal struggle playing out across her face, the conflict between her desire for privacy and the recognition that her secret was now irreversibly exposed. "Sergeant Miller," Michael said gently, "I know this isn't what you wanted, but maybe it's what needed to happen." Sarah looked around the diner, taking in the faces of customers who had watched her work for 3 years without truly seeing her, the elderly couple who had thanked her for her service, the trucker who was now looking at her with obvious respect, even Bob Johnson, who was treating her with a difference she had never experienced in civilian life. The contractors, meanwhile, were preparing to leave their breakfast abandoned as they struggled with the weight of their newfound understanding. Chad approached Sarah hesitantly, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine remorse. "And ma'am," he said, his voice shaking, "I want to apologize. What we said, what we did, there's no excuse for it. We were wrong and we're sorry." Sarah studied his face, seeing genuine regret rather than the casual cruelty that had marked their previous interactions. "Apology accepted," she said simply, "but remember this feeling the next time you're tempted to judge someone by their appearance." The climactic moment came when Michael made a decision that would change not just Sarah's immediate circumstances, but her entire relationship with the community she had served in silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Michael said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command, "I want you to understand exactly who this woman is. Sergeant Sarah Miller didn't just serve in Iraq, she was one of the most decorated medics in her unit, he turned to face Sarah, his eyes filled with the gratitude he had carried for 17 years. She saved my life on March 15, 2006 when our convoy was hit by an IED outside Romani. I was unconscious, bleeding out, and she worked on me for 40 minutes under enemy fire until the medevac could reach us. The diner was completely silent as Michael continued, but that wasn't the only life she saved. During her 2 tours, Sergeant Miller treated over 100 wounded soldiers. She earned a Purple Heart for her own injuries, a Bronze Star with V device for valor under fire, and the respect of every soldier who served with her. Sarah felt tears threatening for the first time in years as Michael recounted her service record. She had spent so long hiding from recognition that hearing her achievements spoken aloud felt surreal. The scars, you see, Michael said, his voice growing stronger, are the marks of courage. They're proof that when her country called, she answered. When soldiers were wounded, she ran toward the danger to help them, and when an explosion threatened to kill me, she threw herself over my body to shield me from the blast. The elderly woman at the corner booth began to cry openly, her husband's arm around her shoulders as they both struggled with the emotion of the moment. Other customers were wiping their eyes, overwhelmed by the realization of what they had witnessed without understanding. Bob Johnson stepped forward, his own voice thick with emotion. Sergeant Miller, I want you to know that you'll always have a job here for as long as you want it. And anyone who disrespects you in my establishment will answer to me personally. The climax reached its peak when a young soldier in dress uniform entered the diner. Having heard the commotion from the parking lot where he had stopped for coffee during his drive to a new duty station, he immediately recognized the significance of what was happening and came to attention, rendering a perfect military salute to Sarah. Ma'am, the soldier said formally, it's an honor to meet you. Thank you for your service and sacrifice. Sarah, overwhelmed by the sudden recognition and respect, found herself automatically returning the salute, the first time she had done so since her medical discharge. The gesture felt both foreign and familiar, connecting her to a part of herself she had thought was lost forever. Michael reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn photograph, a picture of his squad taken just days before the IED attack that had nearly killed him. I've carried this for 17 years, he said, showing it to Sarah. Every face in this picture made it home because of medics like you. The photograph showed 12 young soldiers, their faces bright with the confidence of youth and the brotherhood of shared service. Sarah recognized the type immediately, the kind of unit photo that families treasured and that survivors carried as reminders of bonds forged in combat. I never expected to find you, Michael continued. I've thought about you every day since Romani, wondering if you made it home safely, hoping you were living a good life. Finding you here, seeing that you're okay, it's like a prayer being answered. The climactic moment concluded when Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. For the first time in 3 years, she spoke about her service, openly sharing not just the facts of her military record, but the emotions she had carried in silence. I loved being a medic, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I loved knowing that I could make a difference, that my skills could bring someone home to their family. Losing that purpose when I was discharged, it was almost harder than the physical injuries. The admission opened a floodgate of understanding and connection that would transform not just Sarah's life, but the entire community's appreciation for the hidden veterans among them. Can this moment inspire a community? 6 months after the morning that changed everything at Mel's Roadside Diner, the impact of Sarah's story continued to ripple through the community and beyond. The small restaurant had become an unofficial gathering place for veterans drawn by word-of-mouth stories about the combat medic who served coffee with the same dedication she had once brought to treating wounded soldiers. Sarah had initially struggled with her newfound visibility, but gradually came to appreciate the connections it had created. Veterans from across the region would stop by during their travels, sharing stories and finding understanding in a place where their service was recognized and respected. It's strange, Sarah would tell visitors, I spent 3 years trying to hide from my past, but talking about it has been more healing than all the therapy sessions I ever attended. Michael Kelly had become a regular visitor, stopping by whenever his work brought him through West Texas. Their friendship had grown beyond their shared military experience, built on mutual respect and the unique bond between those who had served in combat zones. The contractors who had tormented Sarah had undergone their own transformation. Chad and his crew had not only apologized publicly, but had organized a fundraiser for a local veterans organization, raising over $15,000 for programs supporting disabled veterans. Meeting Sergeant Miller changed how I see people, Chad would later tell a local reporter. I learned that you never know what someone has been through or what they've sacrificed for others. Bob Johnson had implemented new policies at the diner, including a Veterans Eat Free program on holidays and a wall of honor featuring photos and stories of local veterans. Sarah's story had been featured in the local newspaper, then picked up by national media, inspiring similar recognition programs across the country. Most significantly, Sarah had found a new sense of purpose. She began volunteering at the local VA clinic, using her medical training to help other veterans navigate their healthcare needs. Her experience bridging military and civilian life made her an invaluable advocate for veterans struggling with similar transitions. I thought my service ended when I was medically discharged, Sarah reflected during a speech at a veterans event, but I learned that service is about more than wearing a uniform, it's about using your skills and experience to help others wherever you are. The waitress, who had been laughed at for her scars, had become a symbol of hidden heroism, reminding communities across America to look beyond appearances and recognize the veterans who walk quietly among them, carrying their service with dignity and grace. This story demonstrates how recognition and respect can transform not only individual lives but entire communities, revealing the hidden heroes who serve in silence until someone takes the time to truly see them. Subscribe to Graceful Valor Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.